This is Jason. I'll
Oh,
start, and
Jason.
thank you,
Yeah.
Vice Mayor Chow and Councilmember Moore, for the opportunity. As you mentioned, our firm does specialize in representing small and medium-sized cities. We represent 56 small cities and, again, medium-sized throughout the state. What I will say, and it's a compliment to your leadership as well as your staff, this is a unprecedented workshop. We have not participated in something like this, and I think it's one we may actually steal your idea for some other clients, because it's I think an invaluable part of the process to have community engagement and stakeholders and obviously the mayor, council, and your legislative review committee, and the information you provide, again, I think is invaluable. So if you don't mind, we have a relatively brief, move my icons, a relatively brief PowerPoint, and another compliment to your staff for working with us and putting this together. This is clearly just the introductory slide. What we are seeking to outline as part of this brief presentation is the legislative process, an overview of that process, of how the public can become engaged in the process, the city's engagement, which you have been doing and quite effectively, examples of the legislative process at work, the ones that we can actually tell and share those stories. I'm kidding. And then I quite honestly welcome and look forward to public comment and questions, because if we spent 2 days on this process, I'm not sure we can really cover the nuances, as the Vice Mayor mentioned. So legislative process overview. You obviously have the branches of government: the governor, the executive administrative branch, which includes state agencies, agency secretaries, department heads, and what we call the horseshoe. It used to be shaped like a horseshoe, as you probably all know. The annex to the Capitol is currently being demolished, and the executive branch and the members of the legislature are in what we're calling the swing space. But the term still sticks, and it's the horseshoe, and that's the governor's legislative unit that vets all bills, provides input to members and their staff as the bills work through the process. Quite honestly, the closer the bills get to the governor's desk is when really the input starts being driven by the governor's office, absent members reaching out to the governor's office early. And then moving on, you have the upper chamber, as we call it, the Senate, which is 40 members of the state Senate, and then the Assembly has 80 members of the state Assembly. What I would note is, by way of just elections, the Senate serves 4-year terms, as does the governor. The Assembly, like Congress, is 2-year terms. With the new modified term limits, members are allowed to serve 12 years in either house. You can serve all 12 years in the Senate. You can serve a combination of Senate and Assembly time, but the maximum is 12 years. Prior to modifying the term limits, it was 6 years in the Assembly and 8 years in the Senate. So technically it was up to 14 years, but all the Assembly members obviously couldn't fit over into the 40-member Senate. So you had a lot of intra-party battles that aren't quite as prevalent as they used to be. The other motivation to be in the Senate, just again, this is on the politics, but the other motivation is if you're not in a statewide election year. So if you're a senator that's not up this year in 2022, and you don't seek re-election until 2024, much like Senator Dowley, who's running for governor, he gets what you call a free ride. He can run for governor and not vacate his Senate seat. If he were in the Assembly, as he had been, he would have to make the choice of the Assembly seat versus the Senate seat. That's just the lay of kind of the political land, but it obviously becomes part of the process as well. Moving on, the Assembly bills and Senate bills, those are just exactly as stated. Assembly members introduce Assembly bills. Those bills start in the House of Origin in the Assembly. The senators introduce Senate bills. They start in the Senate, and then they move over. They kind of trade as they move out of the House of Origin, given the legislative process and deadlines. The legislative 2-year cycle, we are currently in the second year of a 2-year cycle. The only thing I would note is, and this is oftentimes confused, in the first year, so last year, 2021, the first year is an odd number, all odd numbered years are the first year of the legislative 2-year session. In the first year, they're not subject to what we call sine die, which is final adjournment August 31st. They can work past the August 31st constitutional deadline. In the second year, the even number years, this year being 2022, they have final adjournment August 31st. So all of the bills have to move out of the legislature down to the governor by midnight, August 31st, with the exception of extraordinary session bills or urgency clauses, bills that have 2/3 vote thresholds. But by and large, all the bills, final adjournment will be on or around midnight of the 31st. Moving on, the Department of Finance, that is the budget staff and the fiscal team for the governor. They too oftentimes provide analyses for bills, particularly fiscal bills, as they are vetted through the appropriations committees. Early on in the process, the House of Origin, if you have a Senate bill in the Senate, very seldom do they have a DOF analysis. You'll see a kind of a growing trend where the governor and Department of Finance let the bills get moving out of the House of Origin before they weigh in. And then lastly, on this slide, trailer bills. And the trailer bill language, it used to be you would adopt trailer bills as part of the main budget bill, the general fund budget. With the passage of Proposition 25 in 2010, trailer bills, well, it's now a majority vote budget rather than 2/3 vote. So the majority party can pass the budget on a simple majority. And we have seen an increasing trend of trailer bills being enacted throughout the legislative process, not just during the June, July budget season. We've had trailer bills already this year attached to last year's trailer bill or last year's budget. And you're seeing major policy shifts being enacted by majority vote as a trailer bill. And the one nuance is trailer bills, again, take effect on a majority vote. I'm sorry, they're adopted on a majority vote, but they take effect immediately as if they're urgency clauses without the 2/3 threshold. So you can appropriate $1 into virtually anything, call it a budget trailer bill, and enact significant public policy changes by way of the legislative trailer bill process. We've seen a growing trend, again, dating back to 2010 with the majority vote budget, but during the COVID pandemic, we saw a number of trailer bills. They haven't stopped for the last 2 years. There's been trailer bills. As a matter of fact, we're going to see one on eviction moratoriums this week. So the Assembly passed it out yesterday. So it's a policy, it's a major change to the process and allows for major policy decisions and changes to be made outside of the ordinary legislative process. The legislative cycle, this slide kind of repeats what I had indicated. You obviously have the legislative branch, the state assembly, the state senate, and the executive branch, which is the governor's office. The legislative branch has the power for making laws, the lawmaking power. And they also, in the event the governor is to veto a bill, the legislature by 2/3 vote can override a veto. Threats have been made, haven't seen one since Jerry Brown, the first go round. So it's been many, many years since, and especially with the majority party and super majority control, we don't see threats of veto overrides as part of the process. One thing I would note on this slide is in a 2-year session, and this could seem daunting for those being involved in the process or members of your public, but it's 6,000 bills roughly introduced as part of it in 2 years, at about 3,000 each year as part of the 2-year legislative cycle. Members technically have a 50 assembly member limit and 40 bills in the Senate. What I would say is there's an old adage, Britannia may rule the waves, or I'm sorry, rule the waves, but only the legislature can waive the rules. If a member needs a bill, they find one. And then quite honestly, as advocates, if we need one, we typically can find one as well. How a bill becomes a law, and maybe this is a little bit of levity, but it's an old adage that says there's 2 things you shouldn't see being made: sausage or laws. There's an example that took place yesterday, and members of the public may have read about it this morning, but the Assembly Transportation Committee and we'll get into this as part of the committee process, but when a bill is before the committee, it's in the possession of that committee, and the chair and the majority of the members voting in that committee can do virtually whatever they want to that bill, irrespective if the author wants it or not. So yesterday, Assemblymember Kiley from Rockland, Republican, he had a gas tax holiday proposal. He was notified that they were going to hear his bill yesterday morning, and by the afternoon, his gas tax holiday, much to his chagrin, was gutted, amended, and turned into a oil corporate profits tax proposal. It passed out on a majority vote. I don't think Assemblymember Kiley is going to want his bill any longer. He went from the author to probably an opponent, but it's just part of the process, and maybe not a one I should highlight too much, but it's part of the process that shows that majority vote and the jurisdiction of the committee, they have a lot of latitude for what they can and cannot amend into bills. And by way of committee analyses, they oftentimes will work with authors much more cooperatively and recommend amendments as part of that process. And probably more importantly for the public, that's where engagement comes in and reaching out to committee consultants and working on analyses, which we will get into in a little bit. This next slide, the typical legislative cycle in California. I didn't choose the word typical, and nor did your staff, but I would say that this, rather than being circular, perhaps this should be a depiction of Lombard Street, because it's about as straightforward as Lombard Street. But I'll try to move through it. As a matter of fact, I'm going to move to the next slide, which is essentially the same thing, but I think it's a little easier for folks to follow. You have an idea which authors, advocates, members of the public, oftentimes in response to things that have taken place within a member's district, the idea becomes the bill, and the member of whoever agrees to author that proposal has to submit the concept. And no matter who drafts it, I often say the brightest law firm in California can draft as many bills as they like. Legislative council will change them, because that is legislative council's job. So they submit the language to legislative council, and legislative council puts it in what they call legislative council format, and that's the introduction of the bill in the first house. From the introduction, it gets referred to a policy committee. The policy committee, it could be one policy committee, which we would call a single referral. It could be double referred, and sometimes bills are triple referred if they touch base on 3 different policy areas. You could have judiciary, natural resources, and local government, or what in the Senate we call it governance and finance. So I apologize if I'm going too quickly, but it starts in the policy committee. If the bill is keyed fiscal, then it then goes to what we call appropriations committee. And then appropriations committee is a unique process. And what I mean by that is all bills with a projected cost, in the Senate, it's $50,000. In the Assembly, it's $150,000. But either threshold could capture 90% of the bills that are keyed fiscal. So if you're projected to have a cost in excess of those 2 thresholds, 50,000 and 150,000, you're placed on what is called suspense. And the Appropriations Committee has a suspense calendar, and then leadership and the authors work between the suspense calendar and the fiscal committee deadline. So on or around that fiscal committee deadline, they will take up the suspense calendar. If you're an assembly member, and you have 5 bills on suspense, you'll be asked to rate or rank your priority bills 1 through 5. And most of the time you don't get all 5. You get 1 or 2 or 3. And obviously based on leadership and projected cost and other factors, some members get more than others. Obviously, if you're the chair of the committee, you have a little stronger footing than perhaps some others. But the long and short of it, the suspense calendar really does change the way the fiscal committee operates. And then one thing I would note for folks that were trying to, if you're involved in the process, in the policy committees, you can testify. In the fiscal committees, you're afforded an opportunity to testify, but oftentimes the authors waive presentation. So their bill is projected to be placed on suspense. They waive the presentation. And if members of the public want to say, as they're rattling through the bills, my name's Jason Gonzalez and we're in support, it's kind of a futile exercise. Most of the time the authors would ask that you not do that because they're waiving presentation, it's going to suspense, and we just await the suspense calendar. So I know that can get a little murky, but the Appropriations Committee is the gatekeeper for projected costs to the state. Then moving on, and in this slide, we're starting in the Assembly. It's green. You'll note in the hallways of the Capitol, the tile floors on the Assembly side are green. On the Senate side, they're red. This is consistent with that. So once your bill moves out of appropriations, you then move to the Assembly floor. You have a second reading, at which time the bill is not eligible absent a rule waiver. And then the bill is placed on third reading. And at the time of third reading, the bill is eligible to be voted on by the entire Assembly. The 80-member House, it takes 41 votes to pass a majority vote bill. It takes 54 votes to pass a 2/3 vote bill. And the Assembly votes by push button. Whereas once your bill moves over to the second House, the Senate, it repeats the same policy fiscal committee, but the Senate votes by a voice roll call. So they call out each member, and if the member's not present, they can place the bill on call. And then the member, they can lift the calls at the end of session or periodically through that session, but the member has to be present to vote. Technically in the Assembly, the member has to be present to vote as well. There have been instances where a seatmate can press the button for their colleague. So, that happens more obviously in the Assembly. One thing I would note by way of process, the line here that says amended, either bill, so let's just say a bill moves out of the Assembly, goes to the Senate, you amend it in the Policy Committee in the Senate or in the Appropriations Committee. Once it passes out of the Senate, off the Senate floor, it then has to go back to the Assembly for what we call concurrence, a concurrence vote, and it's concurrence in Senate amendments. And that happens under either scenario. If it starts in the Senate, amended in the Assembly, you have to go back to the Senate. If it starts in the Assembly and is amended in the Senate, you have to go back to the Assembly. Most bills do get amended in the second House, so concurrence votes are much more common than just going out of the second House straight to the floor, with the exception of trailer bills, which typically aren't amended after the 72-hour in print rule. So that's the process in a nutshell. And what I should note is once you go to the governor, then the governor has 30 days to sign the bills. At the end of session, has 11 days to sign the bills during ordinary session. But when he gets the deluge of bills upon the August 31st adjournment, that last week of session, all those bills fall under the 30-day activity deadline. And as you likely know, unlike the federal government, if the governor does not take action, it takes effect without action. So it's a pocket signature rather than a pocket veto at the federal level. Now that I've perhaps confused everyone, I'll move on to the next, but we'll get to that. So through some of that process, I suspect in questioning. The 2022 legislative cycle, again, it's the second year of the cycle of the 2-year session. February 18th was the deadline to introduce bills. The Assembly introduced 1,400 plus or minus bills. The Senate introduced 714. So we had 2,167, all very much needed, well-intended proposals, but a lot of bills that will move through. And what I should note is when you introduce February 18th, and most of the bills are on or around that February 18th deadline, they have to be in print for 30 days by way of the Constitution, with the exception of budget bills and trailer bills. So most of the bills aren't eligible until mid-March. So right now, we're really starting to see committees ramp up. They will be going on a week spring recess here in the next week, and then they're back for about 6 weeks of session to work through 2,167 bills before the House of Origin deadline. And then that process repeats itself. And so in a nutshell, this is really for the public. Between that February 18th deadline and August 31st, sine die, those 2,167 bills have to move out of the legislature. Otherwise, they are dead. And unlike last year, they can't carry over sine die. They have to be reintroduced. So we've got our work cut out for us in the next 6 to 8 weeks. How to engage. Lots of prayers at church. No, I'm kidding. First, you identify the position, and I say obviously the Vice Mayor and Councilmember Moore have a very effective legislative review committee and a legislative platform. By members of the public, I would say that you want to make your position known. You want to make sure you're clear on what existing law is and what's being proposed to be amended. You can get that information by way of the LegInfo website. All amendments and on LegInfo, you can pull up bills, and we'll provide links as part of this presentation. You can pull up bills and it italicizes the last set of amendments or strikes through what's being amended. And then I would say relationships matter. And whether that's at the local level or at the state level, it's good to get to know who your legislators are. They do appreciate public involvement. They appreciate it when you show up at coffee clutches or meetings. They have their district meetings and just get to know them. And then when you need their support or their opposition, you've established that relationship, and at least they know who you are and you know who they are. But also, I would recommend you draw on what we call your local assets. You have local community groups, you have the public safety organizations, labor organizations, builders, chambers. There's an organization almost for every issue that depending on the issue, you want to be strategic on who you're calling on. But for public safety, Mothers Against Drunk Driving in the local chapters, your local courts, there's a number of assets that can be partners in the process, and you build kind of a larger bench so that when your message isn't lost amongst the many, you have a coalition, and you develop a coalition around the issue. And then just moving through these on the slide, obviously you have support if amended. So you like the bill, but you would like some amendments, you want further clarification, it's a support if amended. Then you have oppose and oppose unless amended, which when I started 25 years ago, support if amended and oppose unless amended used to be the same thing. One's a softer approach, obviously, if you're support if amended, but if you don't get the amendments, you quickly move to the oppose unless amended. So those two positions can interact quite frequently. And then there's a neutral and watch. And then that's when you're really watching for amendments because you may be particularly interested in the subject or the statutory issue. Committee hearings. I know we touched on this briefly as part of the process, but all bills go to Rules Committee, and Rules Committee assigns them. It's really a parliamentary proceeding where they move bulks of bills, hundreds of bills, to policy committees based on the subject matter and which pertinent policy committee. And again, you can get referred to 1, 2, 3. You can be triple referred to a policy committee. But the LegInfo site does a very good job of providing the legislation. It also provides the status and history of that legislation and analyses for the legislation. And the analyses typically break down existing law, what the bill is proposing to do, purpose of the bill as provided by the author, arguments in support, arguments in opposition, and a listing of supporters and opponents as provided to the committee. And it also most notably will tell you what day your bill is being heard on. The rule of thumb is to communicate your position at least a week prior to the hearing. That way you can make it in the analysis and be listed in the analysis. But I would also suggest that, particularly for bills of significant importance, priority legislation, you want to reach out to the committee consultants at a minimum, the author's office. Every member typically has a staff member assigned to that bill that works with the committee consultants, and reach out to them and either express your support, express your concerns, request amendments, seek clarification. They'll provide fact sheets. And if there's anything good that's come out of this, I guess, this new normal of after the, well, as part of the COVID pandemic, a lot of this is being done by way of conference calls, Zoom calls, so members of the public won't have to jump on the highway and drive 2 or 3 hours to at least do the groundwork and communicate with the staff. And also, I would note that district offices are also a resource for communicating with members of the legislature. And then on here, you get a copy of the analysis online. And I would, especially if you're planning to testify, I would definitely make it a rule of thumb to read that analysis and capture the arguments in support, arguments in opposition, and who's in support and who's in opposition. That way you're well read going into the policy committee. But all the steps leading up to, and most notably the conversations, I think are the most important to lay the groundwork for whatever testimony you may be providing. One thing I should note on testimony, most committees limit the support and opposition to 2 witnesses in support, 2 minutes each, and 2 witnesses in opposition, 2 minutes each. As you can imagine, when you get into some of the thorny policy issues, you're not going to move members' positions on a 2-minute argument. So that's where the outreach and laying that groundwork, I call it, becomes critically important. Legislative position letter portal. This is a relatively new part of the process. It has been very effective in allowing members of the public, stakeholders, advocates, our office uses it, all letters have to go through the portal. We still provide copies to the author, to the Republican caucus, the Democratic caucus, the consultants. There's other bases to cover, but at a minimum, you want to get your position letters into the legislative portal. That way it makes it on the analysis, the authors can access them. It's a streamlined part of the process to submit letters. And I'll provide to your staff, and if the Vice Mayor and Councilmember Moore would like to add it to the Legislative Review Committee process, there is some step-by-step instructions. It's about a 1.5-page document that may be worth, I'm just thinking out loud here, which is dangerous, but it may be worth providing to your, putting on your Cupertino LRC website, because it really does show how to use the portal. And admittedly, my staff is far better at it than I am. I should say our colleagues in the office. I'll move relatively quickly. I think obviously the Vice Mayor and Council Member know your current legislators, and the community likely does as well. We're in a fairly unique every 10-year reapportionment time frame where districts have been changed. There's some kind of musical chairs taking place based on the new lines, but currently Senator Cortese is the senator for the city. You have Assemblymember Evan Lowe. Assemblymember Berman has a small portion of the city as well. And then after 2022 election, Senator Cortese will still be the senator. Assemblymember, this says Mark Berman, that's probably our fault. That's Assemblymember Lowe will be the assembly member after November. And moving to 2024, because the Senate districts, Senator Becker is not up in 2022. He'll be up in 2024, so he will become your state senator post 2024. Assemblymember Lowe remains, and again, that typo is our fault, but Assemblymember Lowe remains your state assembly member. I guess the pillow fight, I got all the publicity down there. Apparently, we didn't change the name. For the public, it was a publicized that Assemblymember Lowe and Mr. Berman initially had been in the same district, and they staged a mock pillow fight to figure out who's going to run in which district, and they did work it out without the pillows. So it's good to see. There's plenty of turnover with term limits as it is, and they're two relatively new members of the legislature, and I think will be very effective, continue to be effective representatives for the city. Now for the online resources, this goes through a listing of various information sites, Legislative Analyst's Office, the Department of Finance, where to get the bill information, the Leg Info site, glossary of terms. Senate has a website for legislative history here. And then this is one that oftentimes gets missed, but as part of the budget proceedings, the Department of Finance will put the governor's January budget on their website. The Department of Finance will put trailer bills on their website prior to even being acted upon. And then with the ever increasing trend of trailer bills, they will continue to update those as part of the department's website. So it is a valuable resource to get budget information and actually be able to search for issue areas by way of budget. So for example, local government falls under 9210 as part of the budget. Well, if you go on the department's website, rather than taking a budget bill and reading through the 800 pages, you can search for local government or general government 9210. And then, as previously mentioned, your Legislative Review Committee website has a considerable amount of information. It obviously shares the positions the Legislative Review Committee has adopted. But I think in my opinion, it does a fantastic job of also letting the city and the residents, most notably, know the positions that have been taken and the outcomes on those bills and where members have voted. So it's a fantastic website for the city as well as the community. How the city engages in the legislative process, I think I just mentioned the key part of that process, and that's the Legislative Review Committee adopting your legislative platform. The legislative platform, I think, is succinct, but in our short time of representing the city, it captures a lot of issues and a lot of different policy areas without being 40 pages. And that's a compliment, because in working through bills, you can capture public safety without trying to predict all the various issues the legislature may be focused on, whether it's DUIs or penalty enhancement or so forth. It's, keeping the community safe falls under public safety and can capture a lot more policy. So your platform is, I think, one to model after. Examples of the process at work. What I would note, and this repeats a lot of what I indicated, but it shows two bills and the outcomes. The governor signed both bills into law. SB 9 needs very little introduction to the mayor, council, or community. It was a highly contentious bill. There was no shortage of advocacy on both sides of the issue. I've never been, and I guess this is just my personal perspective, one size fits all has never worked amongst 482 cities in California, and I expect we're going to see quite a bit of challenges. We've already seen challenges on SB 9, but most notably, this shows the committee process, and it shows the approximately 10-month process. And again, as part of that 10-month process, you have about 6 weeks of summer recess, spring recess, and legislative holidays. So things move rather quickly once they get moving. But it does provide for opportunity for community engagement, and obviously the city's engaged in this process. These are additional examples, and unless you would like me to go through each of them, I think these are more for the folks to reference back to. But as I mentioned, it shows the author, it shows, as importantly, where your legislators voted, and the league's position as well as the city's position. So your staff did a fantastic job of breaking this down and giving different examples of, bills that died in committee, bills that were signed into law. So it's you don't win them all, but we definitely try to encourage prioritizing the ones that are most important and working with the members and the mayor and council as you can on, again, the priority legislation. So with that, we've got questions, and if there's any tough ones, Paul is available to answer them.